Gang members threatens fat black woman in a bar. They laughed, jeered, and even threw insults at her. Big mistake. What these gang members didn't know was that this woman once ruled the ring as a boxer. Keep watching to find out how this story unfolds. The bar was a small haven for those looking to escape the outside world. Rain drummed softly against the windows. The low hum of the jukebox played a soft, slow blues, adding to the calm. The smell of old wood, leather, and whiskey filled the room. In the far corner, Nina sat alone, her large frame relaxed but dignified. Her face was calm, almost unreadable, as if she carried stories no one dared to ask about. She sipped her whiskey slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through her chest. Her faded green coat draped over the back of her chair, still damp from the rain outside. Nina wasn't here for conversation or attention, just a drink and a moment of peace. Gus, the bartender, an older man with a gruff but kind demeanor, gave her a small nod from across the bar. They didn't need words. They'd known each other long enough for that. Gus had seen her at her strongest and her most quiet. This place was her sanctuary. The quiet atmosphere settled like a warm blanket until the door burst open with a loud bang. A cold wind rushed in, carrying laughter and shouts. 4 young men strode in, their shoes squeaking on the wet floor. Rain dripped from their jackets, leaving puddles in their wake. They were trouble. You could see it in the way they moved. The way their eyes scanned the room, cocky and restless, like wolves looking for something to pounce on. The leader of the group, Trey, tall with tattoos creeping up his neck, pushed his way to an empty table near the center. The others followed, shoving chairs noisily and making sure everyone noticed their arrival. One of them pounded on the table, demanding drinks from Gus, who remained calm but wary. The regulars exchanged uneasy glances, but kept their heads down. No one wanted to invite trouble. Nina stayed still, eyes on her drink, though she could hear every word. She'd seen men like them before, loud, hungry for attention, desperate to prove they were in control. Tree noticed her sitting alone. He nudged one of his friends and pointed at her with a smirk. "Look at her," he snickered, "sitting there like she's better than the rest of us." His friends laughed, their voices sharp in the quiet room. Nina didn't flinch. She took another slow sip of her whiskey. Tree's grin widened. He sauntered over, his boots heavy on the floorboards. The room grew tense. Gus watched from behind the bar, his jaw tightening, but he didn't say anything. The other patrons froze in place, pretending not to see what was happening. Trey leaned against the bar, just inches from Nina. "Hey, Big Mama," he said with a mocking tone. "What's a woman like you doing in a place like this?" Nina didn't respond. She stared into her glass, her expression calm. Her silence seemed to unsettle him. "You hear me?" Trey's voice rose, laced with irritation. "You too good to talk to me." He slapped the bar hard, making the glasses jump. The sharp sound echoed across the room. The jukebox seemed to quiet itself. The bar fell silent. All eyes turned to Nina, who still hadn't moved. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what she would do. The bar was silent, but inside Nina's mind, a storm began to brew. She didn't flinch at Trey's taunts. Instead, her thoughts drifted, carrying her far away from the dim bar and its stale beer-scented air. She wasn't there anymore. She was back in the arena, under the bright, blinding lights of a packed stadium. The roar of the crowd rang in her ears like thunder. The ring smelled of sweat and adrenaline, the metallic tang of battle filling her senses. She was young, fierce, and unstoppable, a warrior built from grit and heart. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, sending shivers down her spine. The crowd went wild. She remembered the flash of cameras, the sight of eager fans on their feet, shouting her name. But all she saw was her opponent across the ring, a tall, muscled fighter whose cocky grin disappeared after the first round. Nina's fists had spoken louder than any words could. She dodged a wild swing and countered with a hook that sent her opponent crashing to the mat. The referee counted. The stadium felt like it was holding its breath until 10. Victory. Nina had won again. She raised her arms in triumph, feeling the rush of glory like fire in her veins. But behind every cheer and every belt she earned, there was another story. One the cameras never showed. The bruises that colored her skin after each fight, the endless ice packs and sleepless nights. She felt like she'd been fighting her whole life, not just in the ring, but against everything that tried to break her. She fought to prove she wasn't weak. She fought to silence the voices from her childhood, the ones that said she wasn't good enough. The ones that said a girl like her couldn't be strong, couldn't be a champion. She remembered coming home after winning her biggest title, expecting the world to feel different. But the loneliness was always waiting for her. No gold belt could fill that space. The battles outside the ring, the losses, the quiet disappointments, hurt more than any punch ever had. That's why she left. She walked away at the height of her career. People called it a waste. They didn't understand. She wasn't running from a fight. She was choosing peace over pain. The echo of Trey's laughter yanked her back to the present. The roar of the crowd faded. The smell of sweat was replaced by the bitter scent of whiskey. She was in the bar again, the rain still tapping on the windows. "She's scared," Trey called out, his voice cutting through the silence like a jagged knife. His friends howled with laughter. "Look at her, too afraid to even look at me." Nina's fingers wrapped gently around her glass. She lifted it and set it down softly on the bar, the faint clink louder than Trey's mocking words. The room seemed to shrink as she slowly turned toward him. For the first time, she looked him in the eyes. Her gaze was steady, calm, and sharp enough to slice through steel. There was no fear, no anger, just a quiet, unshakable strength. Trey's grin faltered as a flicker of doubt crossed his face. The bar remained still, everyone watching. The storm brewing in Nina's eyes was stronger than anything Trey had ever seen. And for the first time that night, someone wondered if maybe he'd pushed too far. Trey leaned in even closer, his breath hot with the sting of cheap liquor. His grin widened as he continued to mock her. "Come on, lady, let me buy you a drink," he sneered. "Maybe you can teach me how to eat like a champion." He patted his stomach and laughed, his friends joining in with loud, ugly howls. The insult hung in the air, thick and heavy. The bar seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as everyone watched. The regulars stayed glued to their seats, too scared to intervene, but too fascinated to look away. Even Gus, the bartender, had stopped polishing his glass, his face pale and tense. Nina stood up slowly. She didn't rush, didn't slam her chair back. She rose with calm, deliberate grace. Trey's grin faltered. He hadn't expected her to be so tall. He hadn't expected the quiet power in the way she moved. She towered over him, her shoulders broad and steady. For a moment, he hesitated. But then, as if to convince himself he was still in control, Trey smirked and reached for her coat as if daring her to stop him. That was his last mistake. Before anyone could blink, Nana grabbed his arm and twisted. Trey let out a strangled yelp as his wrist bent at an unnatural angle. His friends froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. In one swift motion, Nana pivoted and threw Trey to the floor. He hit the ground with a loud thud that rattled the chairs and made the glasses on the bar shiver. A sharp gasp swept through the room. For a moment, even the rain outside seemed to pause. Trey groaned in pain, clutching his arm as he tried to sit up. His cocky smirk was gone, replaced by shock and fear. He looked up at Nina from the floor, dazed and humiliated. Nina stared down at him, her expression calm and unshaken. Her voice, low but firm, cut through the silence like a blade. "Stay down." The room felt like it was holding its breath. Trey didn't move. He knew better now. His friends, still standing at their table, were frozen in place. One of them, a skinny young man named Dante, took a hesitant step forward. His face had lost its color. His voice was small, almost trembling. "Wait," he stammered. That's Nina Evans, the boxer." The other guys looked at him in confusion. "What?" one of them muttered. Dant's eyes stayed locked on Nina, recognition flooding his features. "My uncle, he used to talk about her all the time," Dant said, his voice rising with disbelief and awe. "He used to say she was unstoppable. He had posters of her fights. That's her. The knockout." The weight of his words hung in the air. The others stared at Nina, unsure whether to run or fight. They could still see the strength in her stance, the way she hadn't even broken a sweat. Her fists were down, but they could feel how easily she could destroy them if she wanted to. Trey shifted on the floor, wincing as he tried to push himself up. "She's a boxer," he croaked, the disbelief thick in his voice. Dant nodded, still staring. "Yeah, and not just any boxer. She was a champion." The rest of the gang stayed quiet, their confidence shattered. The woman they had mocked wasn't some defenseless stranger. They had picked a fight with someone who had made a career out of taking down men twice their size. Nina stepped back slightly, her gaze still locked on Trey. She wasn't here to humiliate anyone, but she wasn't going to tolerate disrespect either. "I'm not here to fight," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But you don't walk into someone's peace and shatter it. Not mine. Not anyone's." Dant nodded slowly, as if he finally understood. The others lowered their heads, shame flickering across their faces. They had come looking for trouble, but they had found something they hadn't expected. The room remained still, the tension slowly unwinding but not quite gone. Trey was still on the floor, his breathing heavy, his pride shattered. The other gang members stood like statues, unsure of what to do next. All eyes were still on Nina, who hadn't moved after delivering the blow that silenced the chaos. Dant's voice trembled. "You were my hero growing up." His eyes were wide with disbelief, as though he couldn't fully accept what he was seeing. "You didn't just fight in the ring, you fought for respect." Nina's gaze softened, though her stance remained strong and unyielding. She had spent her whole life trying to prove herself. Hearing those words from someone so much younger felt like an echo of everything she had once believed. She shook her head slowly. "Respect isn't something you get by bullying others," she said, her voice low but filled with quiet power. "Respect doesn't come from fear. It comes from how you carry yourself when you have the choice to hurt someone, and you don't." Dant swallowed hard, her words sinking deep. Nina took a step forward, towering over Trey, who had managed to sit up, though he still winced with pain. She didn't look down on him with scorn, only with truth. "You're stronger than this," she said. "All of you are. But if you keep going down this path, you'll end up either behind bars or in a grave. And you won't have anyone left to blame but yourselves." Dant's head dropped, guilt pooling in his chest. He glanced at Trey, who looked ashamed rather than angry. "Come on, man," Dant said, extending his hand. "We're better than this." Trey hesitated but then took Dant's hand. With a grunt, he stood, rubbing his sore shoulder. He didn't say anything, but the fight had gone out of him. His cocky grin was gone. Instead, he looked at Nina with something closer to awe, and maybe fear. The bar was still quiet, filled with unspoken emotions. The regulars, who had been too afraid to step in, watched the scene unfold with disbelief. Dant helped Trey steady himself and turned to Nina, his eyes filled with respect. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything." The other two gang members mumbled their apologies too, eyes downcast. Nina nodded once. She wasn't looking for apologies or praise, just change. She turned and reached for her coat, pulling it on with calm precision. Gus, who had stayed silent behind the bar, gave her a small nod of understanding. Nina adjusted the collar of her coat and walked toward the door. The sound of her boots on the wooden floor was the only noise in the room. Before stepping out into the rain, she paused. She turned back, her face calm but serious. Her gaze swept over the young men who had entered with bravado, and now stood humbled. "Make better choices," she said simply, her voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. Dot nodded slowly, his chest rising and falling as he absorbed her words. Nina stepped outside, the rain falling gently around her. The sound of it pattering against the sidewalk filled the night air. She walked down the street without looking back, disappearing into the shadows, as calm and steady as she'd been when she first arrived. Inside the bar, the silence remained heavy but different, less tense, more reflective. The gang members stood awkwardly by their table, unsure what to do next. Trey finally broke the silence with a quiet, "We should go." Dot nodded but didn't move right away. He kept his gaze on the door where Nina had disappeared. "She could have killed you," he muttered, shaking his head in amazement. "But she didn't." Trey didn't respond. He knew Dante was right. The gang left the bar quietly, their footsteps softer than when they'd come in. The other patrons slowly returned to their drinks, but something had shifted. The bar felt different, quieter, more thoughtful. Gus watched the door for a long moment before resuming his work, wiping down the counter with a faint smile. Nina had left behind more than just silence. She had left a reminder that strength wasn't about fists. It was about knowing when not to use them. The gang had come looking for trouble, but left with something they hadn't expected. A lesson they would never forget. What are your thoughts? Share it in the comment. Also do like, share and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks for watching.